Thank you for joining us. I'm Gord Long. As always, it's my pleasure to have back with me today Charles Hugh Smith, well-followed and prolific writer on the web who is the publisher of the website of2minds.com. Welcome back, Charles. Time once again to share some ideas, which I always look forward to. Any key themes in your recent writings that you want to share with our listeners before we start?
Thank you, Gordon. That's a great intro for me. I think what I want to a big theme I want to focus on today, as well as in recent writing, is that what we're talking about when we talk about financialization is the extraction of wealth, not the creation of wealth, and that's the problem.
Good point. I think that actually fits very well with what we're going to talk about today, too. It is the extraction of wealth and how it's extracted. Charles, as I normally do, I need to stress with our new viewers that this is not an interview. We do these videos as a way of us productively dialoguing the important trends we are identifying and simply make our discussions available to the public for those that might be interested or importantly want to contribute comments, which we truly welcome if you would like to add them. Today our talk is a natural follow-on from our last two sessions entitled The Coming Deflationary Tsunami, and the last one called COVID Has Triggered the Next Great Financial Crisis. This is about our observations that it seems to always end the same way, and this time will be no different. We hope to show in this session the key signposts you should expect and watch for. We both have been through this enough times to identify what we think are the common signals. As such, we'd like to cover the subject areas I've listed here. Any comments in that regard before we begin, Charles?
The value here, I think, for the viewers is if you can understand how economic instabilities always end, then you're going to be one step ahead of that instability, and it will protect you by understanding the risk you're exposed to if you stay in the markets as they destabilize, which is what we're talking about today.
Risk and instability, key words to today's session. So let's jump right in on our discussion with what our central message is, and we hope you will take away from the session. We're going to move through the charts quickly for the sake of time, but leave you to study them at your leisure if you so want. In 2012, we laid out this expectations chart of the roadmap we thought we were entering based on what we witnessed coming out of the 2008 financial crisis and where the new policies we were seeing being rolled out would likely take us. The key observation was that central bank policy was reeking of potential moral hazard, which historically and inevitably always leads to unintended consequences, which could be expected to foster dysfunctional markets and marked by market delusions and malinvestments. That is exactly what has happened. We need to understand, as I'm showing here, that moral hazard, as I said, leads to unintended consequences, but critically about the transfer of risk. The transfer of risk always becomes a game of financial wizardry through new esoteric financial instruments. The game of borrowing short and lending long is in itself inherently unstable, particularly when the Fed becomes a manipulator and fails in its parallel regulatory policing role. What triggered the 2008 financial crisis within the short-term funding market is unfolding once again through not too dissimilar instruments and failed approaches to, as I said, the transfer or even the hiding of risk. Comments here, Charles, on the financialization of this?
Well, I'm glad you brought up the term transfer of risk, Gordon, because the key point here is risk cannot be evaporated. It cannot be extinguished. It can only be transferred or hedged. And so when you talk about the transfer of risk and financial wizardry, let's just give everybody an example, which is when the big financiers and speculators took on huge amounts of risk in 2008, and those bets went bad, which we knew they were going to go bad. Then what happened to the risk? They didn't absorb the losses. The federal government and Fed stepped in and absorbed the losses, covered the losses, And so that's what we're talking about here. The risk got transferred to the taxpayers. And so by moral hazard means risk is disconnected from consequences. And what should have happened is all those big banks should have been declared insolvent and liquidated, and the losses distributed to the people who had taken on the risky bets. Instead, the risk was transferred to the taxpayer. And that's one of the games that the financial wizardry you're describing.
And that's what's going to happen again. We, the taxpayer, were once gang, absorb the risk that's being hit. It's always the same. That's what we mean. It's always the same way that it ends. So let's, Charles, put some meat on how this all leads to why you and I are claiming it always ends the same way. Moral hazard is a lack of incentive to guard against risk, where someone is protected from its consequences. For example, in insurance, where you're not incented to make money on your insurance claim. That is, you have more to lose on the claim, or at best, hopefully, you're only made whole, but never better off on the policy. So moral hazard is what central bank policy has effectively created. It is taking the inherent risk of capitalism and market cycles and trying to control and minimize them. That leads to, as you should expect, unintended consequences. And the biggest is the attempt, as we've been saying here, by the markets to play the inevitable game of transfer of risk. What evolves are creative financial techniques and tools to do exactly that. What then inevitably occurs is that some player in this game fails spectacularly and takes others and then the system down with it. That is exactly what happened in 2008, for example. You and I put this chart together in 2014 to show that after 5 years since the financial crisis, we were already starting to witness the same thing once again, only using new names for the same process. The two columns compares, I'm showing here, the evolution. This was in 2014, this time with a new financial target area, and again with little to no regulatory oversight. 2008 centered on credit default swaps, for those who recall, within the U.S. mortgage funding market. We're going to begin to expand on the parallels, but start with today's sovereign credit default swaps. Specifically, something that has never been a problem. Of course, countries have never incurred the debt to GDP they have taken on since the 2008 financial crisis in the U.S. and for those who've forgotten, the 2012 EU crisis, which was then about Greece, Cyprus, and what was referred to as the pigs. They're as part of understanding liquidity, flows, and credit, which we at matsii.com have tracked credit default swaps since their inception for selected countries around the world. A specific representation and time frame is shown here going back to the EU crisis in 2012. It is the reason for the focus on EU countries at the bottom of the table. The chart is way too small to read, so on the right I've exploded the view of what has occurred in the last year. You can see that credit default swaps rose in March of 2020 with the pandemic taking hold and has today fallen back. I guess we would expect that. I think we can agree that the COVID pandemic is likely the greatest global economic and social disaster to have occurred since the 2008 financial crisis, if not an order of magnitude larger than even that. So let me ask two critical questions as we look at this chart. Why did the 2020 credit default swaps, let me call them CDSs, not rise to even the level of the 2012 EU financial crisis? In fact, not even close. Secondly, and much, much more importantly, why, as shown on the left here, have global CDSs fallen steadily and so dramatically since the financial crisis? The question is actually, how can risk insurance fall from, for example, shown here, $514 in Italy in 2012 to $84 today, when the Italian industrial north is in near ruin from COVID? The collapse is the same around the world, and I've only selected a few representative high-profile countries here. Quietly, credit risk insurance has become a fraction of what it used to be only 10 years ago, yet sovereign debt at historic highs against GDP. I mean, what gives? When credit insurance is so cheap, you can take massive leverage risk, going back to Charles, your point earlier on financialization, and yet be protected for next to nothing. Who isn't going to bet the farm with this level of cheap protection? It's just a speculator's dream come true. It's like being given free chips at the casino and saying, go have some fun. Obviously, central bank liquidity will rapidly be turned into financial flows if risk protection costs border on being nearly free. How could this occur? So who is holding the bag? Many of our longer-term listeners will recall it was insurance companies such as AIG during the housing debacle of the 2008 financial crisis. Who and why is actually a presentation unto itself, but let it suffice it to say it starts with the Bank of International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland, and the fact that today's balance of global payments between countries, which they, the BIS, orchestrates and controls, is based on credit and no longer gold. It's based on credit, not gold. We've explained all this at mattasii.com in newsletters and videos, and the fact that credit relates to the level of credit default swaps. The key takeaway is that, like 2008, institutions feel hedged against unimaginable levels of risk through credit default swaps to achieve survivable returns in a zero-rate environment. They have no choice. Charles, any comments on anything I've said so far?
I know this is a difficult topic, but and so I'm going to try to take a shot at explaining it in my terms, because I'm not as sophisticated as you are in my understanding. So when we're talking about financialization, we're talking about obscuring risk and transferring it to somebody else. So you get the gains, but you don't get the losses, right? And so what you're describing here is with insurance against default so cheap, then you're creating leverage, which can then feed speculation. Now, remember, none of this is helping somebody build a new lithium battery plant. All of this is just an extraction of existing wealth. It's a mechanism for speculative gains. It's not actually creating any wealth, not creating any jobs, not improving productivity, nothing. So just as an example of what I think Gordon is describing is go back to the 2008 crisis with mortgages. If you could package a bunch of really like high risk mortgages from borrowers who weren't credit worthy, and you knew they were going to default, and then you could buy insurance for pennies on the dollar, then you could pass off those really bad mortgages within mortgage-backed securities, sell them to somebody else, transfer the risk, take the profit. And that's not an exact analogy, but this is the kind of mechanism we're describing here. Transfer of risk, really cheap insurance, which masks the real risk. It doesn't extinguish it. I don't know if you want to clarify my clarification.
Great job, Charles. Key word is it doesn't extinguish risk. It transfers it. Let me tell you where that risk ends up. It ends up with the public every single time. That's what's guaranteed here. So you just need to know where it's going and how it's going. Why is this important? To do that and put it into context, Charles, as you're doing, is to understand today's money markets and actually the shadow banking system, which financed almost all credit that's being created today. It's not about the banks. It's about money markets and shadow banks, and that is about how they operate. They borrow short and lend long, which in itself is inherently risky and a relatively new development since we came off the gold standard and the world of globalization and financialization emerged. When you borrow short to finance everything long, you live literally day to day, or as the Fed says, overnight in the repo marketplace. So what most fail to appreciate is that since 2016, here in the last 4 to 5 years, is that the holders of the massively exploding U.S. debt is no longer foreigners. That's historically who bought all our debt, China, Japan, etc. They still do, but to a marginal amount. It's not dominated either by the Fed, which everybody presumes is buying all the debt, but rather it's what the U.S. Treasury here I'm showing refers to as U.S. investors. We're not talking about individual investors. The shadow banks is represented by the list of 7 types, at least I've categorized them that way on this chart, of players shown here have increased their holdings of U.S. Treasury debt to 31% of the U.S.'s monstrous growing mountain of debt. Any burp, and the Fed will be unable to counter it. It is now simply too large for the Fed. It is more than too big to fail, for those who recall that moniker. It's just too big, complex, and opaque to stop. This is why the Fed is pumping bonds. It is buying with quantitative easing right back into the short-term funding market in the form of what they call reverse repos to inject collateral to keep the beast fed. And you ready for this, Charles? It's a rate of well over $500 billion overnight, each and every day, and steadily growing. It's not cumulative. Every night they have to put that kind of money to keep this beast fed. It's a ticking time bomb presently going on in the short-term funding arena that is a product of the Fed's own doing, which it's like helpless to fix. Similar to the Titanic that saw the massive iceberg and was also helpless to avoid the danger. Likewise, the Fed has set a faulty course and speed with too small a financial rudder to make the necessary avoidance maneuver. The problem is not liquidity. It is now about a shortage of collateral. Everybody talks about liquidity. No, it's about collateral. And we have to remember that real wealth, which is collateral, can only be created by growing it, mining it, or building it. It can't be created by printing it, at least not for very long. This is where the game gets more interesting, Charles. The game today is in the fabrication of collateral to allow lending to continue to occur. In 2010, in a series of articles I recall writing, and they were termed the sultans of swaps, because I was really concerned about the $600 trillion swaps marketplace, I laid out how a legal concept called novation was allowing something called rehypothecation to occur. When you finance a car, to show you what this means, it becomes collateral for your loan. Under this technique, when that loan is sold to other financiers, the car becomes collateral used multiple times, over and over. If some third party then has troubles, then a whole chain of institutions suddenly have a problem who are tied into the car as collateral. A single car may not be a problem, but billion-dollar loans based on this sort of thing, called asset-backed securities, are. That was what happened in 2010. Today, the shadow banks are engaged in techniques that are simply becoming ununderstandable. And I'm showing here, they're using things like collateral transformations, transformation swaps, contingent collateral, contingent term repos are standard, and so on and so on. And I'm telling you, trying to explain these things is again another presentation in itself. The complexities of understanding where the real risk lies, Charles, as you said earlier, becomes impossible to determine in what is called VAR, that is value at risk assessments that the banks and institutions live with. Charles, if you're getting nervous, it only gets worse from here. Now we have a major disruptive to this fragile, unregulated edifice, an inflation shock, which is now occurring. Any comments before I talk about inflation? Charles, give people a little breather here from getting nervous.
In our pre-recording conversation, you used the term stealth developments in finance, and I think that's a very key explanatory term here, that we understand that these are stealth financial mechanisms and instruments, right? They're not easily visible. They're obscure on purpose, right? And they're complicated and complex. And in fact, many of the people who are buying these instruments don't really understand them. And that was part of what came out in the 2008, 2009 crisis. People were buying these complex derivatives without understanding that they were connecting currency rates and default credit risk and a bunch of different financial measures in one or two instruments which were really opaque. And so that stealth development of um, of unstable financial instruments is the key point here. If you can't understand it, then that is a risk, and that risk creates instability in the system.
If you can't understand the risk, you shouldn't be investing, because underneath it is instability, as you point out. That is exactly what's going on here. Every time there's a crisis, we learn about these new terminologies that were going on and working in all these high-rise towers in downtown major cities, and you wonder what they're doing. Well, they're using all these new begotten tools. And when you listen, as you point out, Charles, to the 2008 financial crisis, at least the hearings, and I listened to them all, I was shocked, not only at what I was learning, but that the people who were buying this truly did not understand it when they were called to testify what the heck they were buying. They just were really naive, and we thought they were experts in all of these, what we were then learning were new concepts. And this is happening again in an order of magnitude worse, in my humble opinion. Now let's talk about inflation as a shock to a system here that is a little worrying if you're listening closely to what we're showing. The global risk-free benchmark in the world is currently accepted to be the 10-year U.S. Treasury note. It has a real yield, according to the Fed, currently of negative 0.87, so let's say 0.9%. Lending is about knowing exactly what your real return is going to be, not the nominal value, but your real return. However, investors aren't stupid. They know that the Fed's 2.32, shown here, 10-year inflation break even, may not even be close to reality. They know the inflation metrics are cooked. It is well documented that the changes made since 1980 to reduce inflation, if removed, would show consumer inflation north of 13%. This is well documented in this chart by John Williams at Shadow Stats. I mean, it's a fact. That's what it is. So what is the number? Is it 13% did you take away, or is it 2.32, or where is it? So what people don't realize is they've created instruments now called, and it was a shock to me, Charles, 6 or 7 weeks ago, 8 weeks ago. I didn't even know that these things were of this magnitude. Something called a new instrument called inflation swaps. This has become a big unreported market since 2016, and here is the concern. It doesn't match the official break-evens, not even close, on a historical basis. The issue is obvious. Someone, somewhere, is going to be caught over their skis big time, sometime in the foreseeable future. Charles, I feel like Michael Burry of the Great Short fame, who in 2007 pointed out something similarly was obvious, but no one wanted to see it or even hear it. It is going to happen somewhere in the short-term lending arena in the future. The timing, nobody knows. Which third party? Nobody knows. How? Well, we really don't know. Is it going to happen? That we can be assured of, because it's the same every single time. The transfer of risk suddenly explodes on somebody and brings down the system. Charles, the last point I'd make, you can count on authorities to change the rules when this happens. That is, to keep things going longer. When cornered, to be frank, they cheat. In 2008, it was the abolishment of mark-to-market of the billions of dollars in financial derivatives on the bank's books to keep things from completely imploding. But the problem today that they can't get around is the consequences of soaring wealth inequality that's overlaying everything that we've just talked about. And this wealth inequality has massive impacts on consumer spending, and in itself doesn't allow the flexibility of increasing debt to the degree that it's been going on. So there's another boundary condition. Do you want to speak to this, Charles? This whole issue with wealth inequality and how it relates to this?
So I think the context I approach this with is, if you're extracting wealth and concentrating it in the hands of what historian Peter Turchin calls a parasitic elite, you've created a huge source of instability in your economy and society because the parasitic elite didn't create that wealth. We all like to think of Steve Jobs and entrepreneurs, but the kinds of financial like leverage and risk transfer and speculation we're describing today has nothing to do with creating jobs and iPhones and new businesses. No, it's all just pure extraction of wealth from the existing system by artifice, manipulation, trickery, obscure complex financial instruments, right? And those are actually bleeding the system dry. In other words, they're extracting wealth and destabilizing the economy and society. And one of the mechanisms here is that by concentrating wealth in the hands of a parasitic elite, that parasitic elite then has the wealth to buy political influence, which they then use to protect all of their what I call skims and scams, which is what we're talking about here, and protecting themselves from the consequences of this rising risk and instability when this whole system you've described breaks down. And in terms of inflation, a lot of people don't understand inflation because that's another obscure, complex topic. But I'll give you one quick example, which we all know about, which is called instead of measuring the actual cost of housing and rent, the government follows something called owner's equivalent rent, where they guess at what the owners of a house would pay in rent. And it's all like, well, wait a minute, why don't we just measure the actual cost of rent and housing? And it's all like, well, because then we'd have a much higher inflation rate. So we don't do that. But the trickery is so absurd. It's like painfully illogical, right? That and yet, why does the system require all these kind of games and tricks to keep inflation supposedly at 2%? Well, as you've explained, Gordon, because if reality was allowed to surface, it would blow up the entire financial system. So, and just I want to tie in real quickly to our previous program on the long cycles we're talking about here. Peter Turchin says 50 years, other people say 40 years. Take your pick. What we do know is that the 40-year cycle of declining interest rates and yields is ending. The 40-year expansion of the workforce is ending. Just a lot of these long cycles have turned. And so the system we're describing today is an attempt to paper over the consequences of those long-term cycles changing, right? Like higher interest rates, higher inflation, higher yields. And they're not going to be able to do it because history is a larger force than the manipulation that we're describing today.
A lot of the things we're saying are a little alarming here today. And you and I have been doing these videos for, I don't know, 10, 15 years now, a long time. And I've seen a lot of financial crises. I was heavily invested in, unfortunately, in 1986 when we saw a 20% decline in the market in one day. I was involved very heavily in 2000 dot-com bubble, 2008, and other less visible ones. They're all frightening. As negative as sometimes our comments are, Fanar, in these videos, you and I really haven't been alarmist. We have simply pointed out the problems. I think that in this video and the last two we've put out, I think for the first time in 10 years at least, we're really starting to blow the whistle here. There's a problem, and it's serious, and it's getting serious by the day. And that doesn't mean it's going to happen tomorrow, and it doesn't mean it's going to happen next month, but it's going to happen, and it's going to happen badly. And so there are times in your investing periods of life when you're better not to be in a risky environment. And this is as high a risk environment as I've seen. I think, frankly, in my lifetime as an investor, I've never seen risk at this level. That's quite a statement for me to make because I've taken on a lot of risk in my life. So I really caution our listeners. I'm not saying to do anything dramatic. I'm saying to, talk to your financial advisors. But this is a high risk environment. And the biggest risk is not about not making money. The risk is about keeping your money that you have in your capital right now. So with that, I would make that as my closing comment. Charles, any closing comments you'd like to make?
Just to add to your final point, what's unique about the level of risk now, I would just say, is the scale. If you notice some of the charts that Gordon's posted, the scale of debt and leverage and gambling basically is like literally unprecedented, right? The scale of the risk is extraordinary. The complexity, I hope you understand a bit of it now. The complexity is also an order of magnitude higher than it was in the past. So the risk is more obscured. It's more difficult to assess, and that in itself is a risk. My last point is that I hope you understand that from the charts that there's very little buffer here, and in other words, when there's a sell-off or a panic, there's no buffer left because the scale of the bets and the leverage and the debt are so much larger than the system can swallow. And so it's like when you're watching a video and the buffer goes to zero, your video freezes, and that's what's going to happen. Is the system will freeze, and you won't be able to access your account. You won't be able to sell, buy, whatever. And we saw a taste of this when Robinhood, the trading platform, almost went down off of the volume in one stock, GameStop. And a lot of insiders were made very nervous by this. And so the system has multiple layers of fragility and instability. If it just had one problem, then you could say, okay, all the resources of the government and the Fed could be applied to fix that. But no, we're talking about multiple interlocking levels of fragility and instability. And that's what makes us so wary of the risk.
Yeah, these problems are around the world. So solutions won't be just a solution within a country, and the coordination itself, as complex as this, is almost insurmountable to be able to solve it. For many of our listeners, they have not been in an environment where we had lock limit down, callers that were in, and there would be days on end where the markets were not allowed to be opened. And you're sitting there not knowing how to get out of a position, not knowing what your positions are actually worth when things finally open. There is nothing you can do, not even knowing whether the money that you think you've made is actually going to be delivered because the third party has failed. That is potentially, if we're correct in what we think is in the future, possibly, and I stress the word possible, then that is what you need to really concern yourself with. And the word possibly is never, ever underestimate what the powers to be will do to keep the system going. It buys more time. And to be really blunt, they cheat. They change the regulatories, they change the basic underpinnings, which makes the problem even worse to buy time. And so don't, say, come back to us and say in 3 months, well, it didn't happen. Just know that you've probably just taken on even more risk than you were aware. Charles, we need to break because we try and keep these down to a manageable level of time. There's so much in this subject. Can you tell our listeners where they can read more of your findings?
Yeah, please visit me at of2minds.com, and there's free samples, chapter samples of all my books and much else free content.
Thank you very much, Charles, and I look forward to the next session. Talk to you again.
Okay. Thank you, Gordon.